Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. On this week's episode, it's really a pleasure and a privilege to have Lord Matt Ridley join the program. Matt Ridley is the author of some of my favorite books, some of the most important books I've ever read. The first of which being The Rational Optimist, which really paints a picture of a world that continually gets better in spite of the fact that all of us are hardwired to be pessimistic, to fear the lion in the dark, so to speak. And this book explodes that bias we all have and paints a picture of a world of continual improvement. And so it's for that reason that I was anxious to have Matt come on in this period of the pandemic crisis with COVID-19 and the coronavirus, because he has not been a overly optimistic guy when it comes to this crisis we're in. He has sounded the alarm like so many others. And when Matt Ridley says we've got a problem, we've got a problem. So I was anxious to talk to Matt to get his take on what's happening in this moment we're in, how we should think about it, and how those of us that cling to being rational optimists can understand a world in crisis. And so I'm excited to share this conversation with you. And I also encourage all of you listeners to watch out for Matt's new book that's coming out in May, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. I am sure that this is going to be another important contribution to the way all of us think about progress and the future of civilization. And without further ado, this is Matt Ridley. So Matt, you've played a very important role in my own personal, both mental, like an emotional reaction to what's happening with this coronavirus epidemic, because you are my rational optimist spirit animal. Your book, The Rational Optimist, is one of the most important books I've ever read. It frames the way I think about the world. I recommend it to everyone I meet who is in the catastrophic mindset and thinks everything's getting worse. And so when I saw the first article you had written saying this thing might be the wolf instead of the boy who cried wolf, this might be the actual wolf, that gave me real pause. It really changed what I was at that moment thinking was maybe being overblown by politicians as
a friend of mine said, if you're scared, then I'm really scared. Because I had a reputation of debunking pretty well every scare, and it stood me in good stead doing that over the last 20 years, really saying, no, you're exaggerating that problem, whether it's something to do with pollution or the environment or something to do with all sorts of other problems. And I was, as soon as I got my head around what was happening with this virus, once it spread out of China, and how it managed to combine being very contagious with being quite lethal, at least to some groups of the populations. It's not overall very lethal, but it is pretty dangerous for elderly people. I began to see that we did need to take this very seriously indeed. And it's proved to be much tougher to get on top of it than I think any of us had hoped even a few weeks ago.
So there's no shortage of crisis talk at any given time, right? There's always
Correct.
people who believe that the sky is falling, that inequality is exploding, that the climate's going to kill us all in 12 years. There's all these sort of bombastic claims that we hear. And your way of thinking, your data-driven way of approaching these issues, and also just I think the philosophy that underpins your approach to progress, that everything evolves and that we make this incremental evolutionary progress towards a better world each and every day. That has that's always been my lodestar. And so what I now struggle with, and what I hope our conversation can really be about, is how do I, or how do those of us out there who aren't catastrophic thinkers or have trained ourselves to try to be allergic to that, because how do we negotiate the information landscape that we're in now? Because I
Yeah,
don't know how to separate the every crisis is opportunity, um,
yeah,
political hype, media hype. If it bleeds, it leads. There's so many reasons why the world of information that comes at us is always crisis oriented, but now maybe it's true. So which part's true, and how do we know which part to
right.
believe?
Right. Well, how do we tell when there is a wolf, given that people are crying wolf pretty well every day on a pretty promiscuous basis? And episodes like the Y2K millennium problem of 20 years ago, when we were told that all the computers in the world would crash and society would come to an end at 1999 at the end of the year if we didn't do something very expensive to all our computers. Um, are quite interesting little sort of dry runs for this, because obviously that didn't happen. So a lot of us went around saying, see, you were exaggerating the problem, to which people replied, no, no, it was only because we dealt with it that it didn't happen. It was
Right.
only because we spent a lot of money on on consultants, that it didn't happen. And I don't think that's true at all, because there were lots of industries, lots of countries that did very little and they were fine too. So I think that's a very clear example of a wolf that was called and it turned out not to be a wolf. Ones like climate change, you can keep postponing the crisis and say, yeah, okay, the weather's not that much worse yet. It's a little bit warmer. It might be a little bit wetter, or maybe seeing a slight change in storminess, although there's evidence for that's pretty poor. But you wait for 30 years and you'll see what happens. Well, I've been waiting for 30 years. I've covered that story for over 30 years now. I first wrote about it in the late 1980s when I was science editor of The Economist, and I was fairly worried at that time. And I'm pretty sure that we are still exaggerating that problem, that it isn't nearly as bad as we think. In a few decades' time, our grandchildren might experience a slightly warmer world, which might be a little bit wetter and maybe a tiny bit stormier and slightly higher sea levels. But I really do think that it's not going to be much worse than that. So I don't understand people who say this is undoubtedly the greatest crisis humanity is facing. Um, uh, and we've spent so much emotional and financial energy on uh, talking up that scare that we've left very little oxygen in the room for things that really are scary. And this virus is scary. It's not the end of the world. It's not going to wipe out the human species. It's not very lethal. It's got a 1% or less mortality rate and much lower in people who are healthy. Um, but nonetheless, it can do a lot of damage. And it can do a lot of economic damage as well as a lot of actual damage to people's lives. Um, what's the difference? Why do I think this one is worth worrying about? And the answer is uh, because of that exponential curve that it's capable of doing. One virus leads to two viruses because, on the whole, people are passing it on to about two people in an unlocked down society, as far as we can make out. And then two leads to four, leads to eight, leads to 16. Before you know where you are dealing with gigantic numbers. That's the beauty, I almost said, but the horror is perhaps the better word, for an epidemic, a pandemic, and why they really do have to be taken very seriously. And in the past, they were the cause of immense problems in human society. The Black Death killed, 40% of the population of Western Europe, probably. Smallpox wiped out most of the children in most generations for hundreds of years until we worked out how to vaccinate against it and so on. So we know these are capable of being lethal, of being dangerous at least. We know we've greatly improved our chances of surviving pandemics, and we've got rid of most infectious disease as a cause of mortality. From whooping cough to cholera, they're no longer a big threat in human society. But we know that we still spread respiratory viruses very freely. We call them the common cold, and they're mostly pretty harmless. But if one of those were to turn harmless, then it's a real problem. And that's sort of what brings me to the thinking that this one does need to be worried about. Whether we're right to shut down the entire economy and do real harm that way just to stop it is still an open question.
What's the what's your sense of the difference between different government responses? Because, and I think this is in a sense unanswerable, but it seems like right now the Sweden has maybe the most permissive policy at the national level of the Western countries. I might be missing others, but um, and so far, so hard to keep track. But it seems like they're not necessarily experiencing, or we don't know them to be experiencing more deaths. Which is the only one that I trust is the deaths, because
Yeah.
they talk about the cases, but they're not testing everybody. So and since this doesn't present symptoms necessarily quickly, maybe not even at all for some people. Talking about the cases and going to that Johns Hopkins website and looking at how many cases, that seems like a piece of like slightly misdirective information.
No, I think that's exactly right. And that's particularly true in my country because the UK has been very slow to ramp up the testing. We were doing quite a lot of testing compared with countries at the start. We're still doing about the same number, whereas other countries like the USA, slow off the blocks, have now vastly increased their testing. So they're doing 20 times as much testing as they were, and they're finding a lot more cases. Whereas here, we're not even testing people who have clearly got it. People who are staying at home, who've got all the symptoms. I know several people who are in that position, and I've spoken to them on the phone, and they've not been had an opportunity to be tested. So we know that we're testing a very small minority. You're right that the deaths number is the one to watch. That's the one that's telling you what's happening in different countries. And it's a pretty scary trajectory. We're all following Italy at this stage, or not all, but mostly, with the big exception of the Asian countries, particularly Korea, Taiwan, and Japan to some extent, which, and of course China itself, which have managed to produce much slower increases, and in some cases pretty well damped it down altogether. And it seems like the difference is testing and contact tracing. It seems like at the moment that's the only weapon we have against this virus, is to find out who's got it and who's been in touch with people who've got it. Um, because, as you say, the scary thing about this virus is that it is passed on by asymptomatic people or people who have not yet developed symptoms. On average, 4 days into an infection, you're giving it to someone else, whereas with SARS, it was 8 days. With flu, it tends to be towards the end of the time you've got it. So this early transmissibility is a real problem. Now, in South Korea, you can be contacted via an app to say, look, it turns out 4 or 5 days ago you came into contact with someone who has now developed the virus, so you should self-isolate. That's where we've all got to get to as a technique to shut it down. Whether the Swedes can do that without locking down all work and shopping and everything else the way the rest of us have done will be very interesting to see. And I suspect that they are banking on being a more uh, um, obedient society, a more distant society than the rest of us. That on the whole they're more sensible or something, and it may be right. I'm not trying to undo that. We also need badly to find out how much it's spreading within the healthcare system. I think that's one of Italy's problems, is that within the hospital system it got established pretty early on, so that people who were coming into hospital because they were old and frail were being given an extra disease, and one that was possibly lethal. So there's a lot we don't know, but I am a rational optimist. We will find ways of testing, ways of diagnosing, ways of contact tracing, but also ways of curing, ways of treating people, and eventually ways of preventing it through vaccination. it's come as quite a shock to me and others to find out just how slow we still are at developing vaccines. In my new book, How Innovation Works, which is coming out in May, unlucky timing, but there we are. In my new book, I discuss the case of the two rather splendid women who invented the whooping cough vaccine in Michigan in the 1930s, Pearl Kendrick and Grace Eldering, because they went from nothing to a workable vaccine distributed throughout the country in about 4 years. And that was an incredibly impressive achievement. On the whole, we struggle to achieve that sort of rate of development of a vaccine even today. And when you think how much more knowledge we have about the DNA sequence, the protein structure in a virus, we really ought to have got better at this. And it turns out that in our obsession with climate change, we've neglected to prepare for much more dangerous problems like this.
It's interesting that you frame it that way. Is that a fair framing? And what I mean by that is, I think it's unquestionably the case that climate change has been treated in many quarters as the single greatest threat humanity faces. No question about it. But all the while, hundreds of billions of dollars is still spent across the country, across this country and around the world, on healthcare and on basic research by both private sector and public sector. So is that trade-off of consciousness truly I mean, at some level it almost of course must be, because priorities find their way into decision making in a lot of domains. But we probably are spending more now per capita on research than
That's
was done
yeah.
100 years ago, right? Is that right, or is that not true?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, that's absolutely true. And no, you're right to pick me up on that. But there have to be consequences of going around saying this is by far the most important thing that we should be worried about. That's bound to make it harder to talk about other problems. And in this case, there was a very specific problem staring us in the face. I'm not claiming prescience here. I didn't spot this, so I'm not saying that I was wise about this. There was a very specific problem, which was that yes, we have a huge research industry devoted to researching uh, diseases of lifestyle, diseases of the Western world, and to some extent infectious diseases, and how to cure them. And a gigantic pharmaceutical industry working on these problems, but very little work going into new vaccines. And the reason for that was because it's very hard to make money out of a vaccine. It's needed in a hurry, in a panic, and then suddenly it's not needed anymore because you've defeated the problem or the problem's gone away. In the case of the Ebola epidemic of 5 years ago, by the time the vaccine was ready for testing, the epidemic was over. So whoever'd invested in trying to make that made no money out of it. And now some people did spot this. The Gates Foundation teamed up with the Wellcome Trust, an equally big charity based in London, and the Norwegian government and the Indian government, and said, let's set up something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. Let's set up something that can fund the development of vaccines in particular, but also other measures to make sure we're ready for an epidemic when one comes along, because SARS has been a warning and Ebola has been a warning and swine flu and bird flu were worries. And sure, they didn't turn out to be as bad as we feared, but the next one might. Now, they only got going in 2017 and they have made good advances and they are being very useful in the present epidemic. But if they'd got going 10 years earlier, then I think we would be in a much better position to do something about that now. Because somebody's got to find philanthropic money to pay for vaccines, because commercial they're not profitable things to develop.
I'm not especially well read on at least in the United States, the structure of the industry. I when it comes to vaccines, I do believe that there might be a secondary issue beyond just the business model problem, which is, I think when they are needed, there's often pretty stringent price controls and things that make those moments even more difficult, as far as government policy kind of wiping out the vaccine industry on top of it being a hard business to be in.
Yes,
Um,
I think that's not wrong. I mean, I think there are you're told how much you can charge. Then there are regulations about testing it for safety that are obviously very strict, and then there's intellectual property that gets in the way. I mean, one of the things we're rapidly trying to do at the moment is get people to pool or waive their patents on technology so that we can say, look, let's not worry about that. Let's not worry about what this belongs to. At the end of when this is all over, we'll look back and work out whether somebody's patent was infringed and he deserves something. Well, that tells me that patents and copyright, intellectual property in general, is not what it's held up to be, that is to say, a help for innovation. It's on the whole a hindrance. And there's a very strong literature on this.
oh
People like
yes.
Alex Tabarrok have been writing about it, pointing out that actually patent thickets, patent trolls, and the ridiculous idea that one person out of this huge web of people who put together an innovation deserves to sort of scoop the pool and get a huge fortune out of it, just because he's somehow been lucky enough to get his patent application into the patent office first. It's a crazy way of running the system. Likewise, copyright. I mean, under pressure from people like the Disney Corporation, we've extended the rights of copyright holders, made them much easier to claim, uh, extended them to 70 years after the death of the author. That means when I die, hopefully not soon, 70 years after that, my grandchildren are still going to be raking in not very much money. Well, why should they? Let them get a job.
I came across a book against intellectual monopoly. I believe it was Michelle Boldrin was the author.
Yes,
Part
she's great on this. Yeah,
and uh, and it basically made the case that, just as an empirical
he is.
record of history, um, patents are not helpful outside of one particular domain. Uh, and before I say what that domain was, the great example is, we already talked about Bill Gates. Well, Bill Gates himself said, had there been copyright or patent protection on software, on computer code in the early 70s, during that era of the homebrew computer club, and Steve Jobs and Wozniak in their garage, and Gates trying to get DOS off the ground and writing BASIC and all these, the whole industry would have been stillborn. It would have been impossible. And that
Correct.
and then if you go back in time, what you find is innovators are basically never the ones to get the protection of intellectual property protection. It's always existing players looking to keep competitors out. And he said the
That's right.
one
Well, it's not always, but it is often
overwhelmingly.
a barrier to entry. And where the inventor does get the patent, he then spends the rest of his life in a miserable battle to defend these patents. So people like Samuel Morse, the Wright brothers, Marconi, they spent half their life in court defending the patents they'd claimed against rival claimants, some of whom had a good point that they had actually invented part of the technology or something just as important. So these guys ruined their lives when they should have just got on and made the next device that was better than the last one. The first mover advantage. And you're right that one of the reasons the software industry has been such a spectacular place for innovation in the last 20, 30 years is because on the whole, it's moving so fast that there's not much point in sitting back and trying to rake in money from a patent. You're better off just moving on to the next technology and getting a first mover advantage with a little bit of tacit knowledge that's up your sleeve.
The one area that has been pointed to, I think, by a lot of this literature as being perhaps an exception to the rule is pharmaceuticals, because
Right.
the production once you know that some molecular compound has this great effect, this reproducing that compound is basically free. It's so there's all this upfront cost, a lot of which is complying with the government regulations to get the drug passed, especially here in the U.S. where the FDA, if there's one thing that we're all seeing now is how many people die because we have the FDA as opposed to how many people are protected by it. How many,
Yeah, it's a very difficult balance to get right, that, of course. But yeah, absolutely right. The opportunity cost of not bringing drugs to market, and it costs $1 billion to bring a drug to market, at least these days. And if you were to spend $1 billion to go through 3 phases of clinical trials and prove that your drug worked, and then you ought to wake up the next day and find that some generics manufacturer could make it for and sell it for pennies, then something's wrong. That clearly. So you're absolutely right. This has to be an exception. But even in that industry, when you look at what the monopoly profits from a drug are spent on, they don't tend to get spent on more research. They tend to get spent on defending the patent and erecting barriers to entry. So there may be different ways of doing patents, variable length patents, and in the current case, there's ideas you could buy out patents. You could say, look, we need to get this into manufacture quickly. So the government will come along and buy it out, and that means that the drug will suddenly become very cheap and available to everybody, and everybody can make it. There are ways in which we could make the intellectual property system more flexible, even in the pharmaceutical industry.
So one of the things that this is going to bring to the foreground and already has in some quarters is calls for changes in provision of healthcare. Certainly here in the United States, where we for all of the role the government plays in healthcare, which is enormous, it is still not a single payer system or a nationally administered system. We still have these little pockets of faux private management of healthcare in the United States. And I say faux because when the government tells you what you can do, who can do it, how many of those people can do it, what they can charge, and then spend 2/3 of the money saying it's a free market or it's a private healthcare system is kind of a joke.
Yeah, I agree.
But we definitely are going to see and are already seeing calls for nationalization of even more of the system. You're in the UK. You have the National Health Service. Do you have a perspective on how people who don't have an axe to grind but are looking at this and trying to understand, do they have a point? Is this why we need government to run healthcare? What's your take on that, having grown up in a nationalized system but also obviously very familiar with the US?
Yeah, exactly. Well, in both the UK and the US, health is very political. It's a big part of the political argument, and a lot of people are very unhappy with the way it's done. And in the UK, it takes the form of saying, why isn't the government spending more on this? We have this treasured national health service that provides that everybody gets exactly the same treatment, and yet you can't get an appointment with your doctor because people use doctor's appointments for all sorts of trivial things like bits of advice on things and so on. Because it's free at the point of delivery, it is abused to some extent, and it's underfunded because it's entirely dependent on the taxpayer. So on the whole, that means that rich people are not contributing proportionately more, which is a pity. In between those two extremes, the American system and the UK system, there is, for example, the German system, where, yes, it is basically free because your contribution to it is deducted from your pay in the same way that income tax is. But that contribution is not given to a government-run monopoly to provide you with healthcare. It is then used to pay insurance premiums with huge market power on behalf of the taxpayer, so as to get a good deal, but with a thoroughly decentralized and competitive system to provide the results, the healthcare. And on the whole, Germans don't bother about it. They're quite happy with their health system. There's no huge political fuss about it. It's quite well funded. It's not particularly expensive. And we're now seeing the results in the coronavirus epidemic, which is that Germany is doing a huge amount of testing, has got a very low mortality rate, has a large number of intensive care beds, is performing really well in this epidemic. Why is that? Well, I've just been looking into that in the last 24 hours, particularly on the question of testing. How are they able to ramp up testing so much better in Germany than in the UK? And it turns out that there is no single public health laboratory, as there is in the UK, which in the UK has clung on to a monopoly on all the testing, has insisted that all the testing either goes through it or is reconfirmed by it, and as a result has run out of capacity. In Germany, there's no such thing. Private firms, charities, universities, anyone can bid to do PCR testing for COVID-19, and there are checks by regulators to make sure that they're getting good results from them. But it's not a monopolistic, not invented here attitude from inside a centralized system. Now, America had exactly the same bureaucratic resistance at the start of the epidemic, the CDC insisting that all the testing must be done by it, that only its tests were any good. Turns out they weren't very good, etc. And around the middle of March, America said, forget this isn't working. Any company or lab that can do this can do it as long as we have a way of checking that you're doing it well. And as a result, has expanded its testing capacity 20-fold in the last couple of weeks, which is an incredible performance. So it does feel to me like it's a huge mistake it's a great idea that everybody gets healthcare at the same cost, that it isn't something where only the rich can afford cancer treatment. We must find a way of achieving that. But the idea that the only way to do that is to have a great big Soviet-like centralized monopoly that actually provides the healthcare is a mistake. You should acquire healthcare from lots of competing providers and get them to compete to provide it at good quality and low price. But you should make sure that everybody gets access to it. And I think a lot of countries have cracked that, and they don't include Britain and they don't include America for two different reasons.
One of the features that I've noticed in American governance, and I'm tempted as a classical liberal to apply this to the government as a fundamental concept or as an institution, but I think it does apply in varying degrees, is our government at almost all levels seems to operate fairly indistinguishably from a mob racketeering machine. And I'm being bombastic here on purpose because, and I come from a family of doctors. My father's a surgeon. Both of his parents were doctors, which means my grandmother was a really uniquely woman doctor for her generation in Philadelphia. I've got doctors everywhere I turn. If I go to a family event, there's doctors everywhere. Because as an Italian immigrant, you're either there's like genetic desire to either be a doctor or a lawyer.
Right.
You came over, you worked on docks as in DOCK,
right,
and you want to be a doc.
That's nice.
But what I observe is at every level there is this desire to spend, and then there is structures to restrict how many suppliers there are. There's licenses and quotas to prevent more doctors. So medical schools have quotas for how many doctors they can accept every year. In every state, there's or almost every state, there are various rules that restrict how many hospitals can be created, and the people that sit on these boards that decide whether there is a need for more hospital beds, as if there's ever such thing as we don't need any more hospital beds, or more MRIs or tests. It always tends to be the people who currently own hospitals that are playing a role in deciding this. And I think this is this dividing, it's an ideological dividing line that happens in the United States, where well-intended people can look at that and one will say, see, this is the corporate takeover of our government. This is why we need this is why we need the government to just get rid of all these people and take it all over, because then we won't have these private profiteers trying to restrict supply. And I think they say that with all good intentions and a belief that it's private profit that's driving that. And then you have people like me who say it's the monopoly of power of government that even makes this thing possible, because everyone wants a monopoly. Politicians want a monopoly. Corporations and their management would love to have a monopoly. It makes life easier. The thing that prevents monopoly is not total monopoly, but it's competition and free entry.
Exactly. Well, the idea that you fight monopolistic tendencies of corporations by handing everything over to the ultimate monopoly, which is one government, which not only has a monopoly on deciding who can operate in a particular space, but has a monopoly on violence. Which is that's the sort of definition of government, is that it's the thing with a monopoly on violence. That's always struck me as pretty crazy. And yes, the pattern is that industries, corporations, interest groups will always pressure government to give them more barriers to entry, so that they don't have to worry so much about competition, and so that they can increase the prices they're charging or increase the amount of business that they can command. And they'll do this in all sorts of ways. And occupational licensing, as you say, is a big way in which this happens. It becomes necessary to get a government-granted license to operate in a certain field. In my new book, How Innovation Works, I mention that in Florida, to practice as an interior designer, you have to go through a pretty long course. And if you come from Alabama and you qualified in Alabama, that's no good. You have to re-qualify in Florida. I mean, God forbid that we have Alabama standards of interior design popping up in Florida. That would be a catastrophe, wouldn't it? They've got absurd, these occupational licenses. And of course, it's not absurd to say that a surgeon or a doctor must be qualified, but it is absurd to say that let's limit the number, because then they can charge more. And that does happen all the time. Brink, Lindsey, and Steve Teles have a very good book on this called The Captured Economy, about all the ways in which government has become a place for would-be monopolists to argue their case, when in fact government should be the very opposite. It should be arguing on behalf of the consumer, not the producer, the whole time. I sit in the House of Lords, which is one of the houses of our legislature, and I'm gobsmacked by how often my colleagues are talking up the interests of one producer group or another, one interest group or another. I mean, it might be an environmental organization, that wants to achieve something, but in the end, it's asking for more business. It's saying, we need more regulation so that we can apply for the grant to enforce these regulations, or whatever it might be. But the number of times people get up and stand and say, well, hang on, what about the consumer here, is much fewer, actually. And people aren't even aware they're doing it. They think that their job as a legislator is to get up and represent the interests of some producer with a concentrated interest, and often a concentrated problem. There often is an unfairness that has developed that needs to be redressed. But the diffuse cost to the consumer of all these regulations and barriers to entry and tariffs and everything else is forgotten about, and that seems to me the big problem that was identified by people like Mancur Olson and others as being, that government is essentially used as a mechanism to reinforce special interests, and we have to find a way of combating that. And we do find ways. It's not impossible, but it is the problem that fewest people realize is happening.
As we wrap up, there's sort of two futures that concern me, and I imagine concern you, and you've written about them. One is obviously the path of this disease, and how we might think about when it will come under control. The other is the path of globalization and the path of the engines of progress that many people misunderstand, but that are, I think, if you spend any time studying them, are unequivocally the key, and that is what is sometimes derisively called neoliberalism. I think of myself as a neoliberal, but is the idea that, you know what makes the world a better place? Free people being able to move about this planet and coordinate, cooperate, and compete with each other, so long as they don't hurt each other. And that basic premise is the engine of opportunity. It's the engine of uplift for the poor people around the world and for everyone. And I think that is going to be threatened. It's going to come out of this with two black eyes, probably, because the free movement of people is going to be blamed for the spread of the virus, even though no one really appreciates quite what they're saying when they say that. It's like, do you mean we should shut down international travel forever? It's going to be,
Right.
we're going to have claims that we need to close up our borders. Look, Europe had to close up all their open borders. It's like, yes, but even with totally closed borders, you'll still have international travel. So viruses will get there, even if you can't become a citizen. The virus doesn't care if you're a citizen or not. How are you, to come back to optimism? What are the causes for optimism in this time of extreme assault on those of us that have worked so hard to be rational optimists?
Yeah, it's really tough, and there's a battle royal to fight as we come out of this to win the cause for freedom as the engine of human prosperity going forward. I wrote my book, my forthcoming book comes out in May, about innovation. Obviously, finished it in September before this disease even existed in human beings. So it's not about that, but there's quite a lot in it that is of relevance. And I end the book saying we live in an age of not having enough innovation. We think we live in an age of incessant innovation, but actually, if you look around us, apart from in the digital area, we're pretty sluggish. We haven't got the turnover of firms, of entrepreneurs, of new ideas that we had even 20, 30 years ago. We're experiencing an innovation famine, and innovation is what drives prosperity upwards. There's no doubt about that. And what drives innovation is freedom to exchange ideas, freedom to meet other people and recombine your ideas with them. That is the basic underlying premise of my book. So, how do we get back on track and make sure we do enough innovation to keep the show on the road and keep prosperity moving forward? And as we come out of this pandemic, as you say, some people will say, right, well, that's it for globalization. It was a mistake. We need to erect barriers. Other people will come out and say, I now really appreciate how valuable it is to be able to buy anything from anywhere in the world, go anywhere I want, speak to anybody I want to. Because for the last 6 weeks or 3 months or whatever it's going to be, I've been cooped up in one house or one flat, um, unable to visit even my relatives, unable to go to a party, unable to order stuff from the other side of the world, unable to plan a holiday. And I don't like it. And I realized that was a really precious thing. And whatever it takes to get that show back on the road, I want to do it. Now, I'm in that latter camp, as you can probably tell. And I would like that to be our reaction as we come out of this. And so what we need to do is say, yes, there is one respect in which we need to be really much more careful about globalization, and that is the spread of diseases around the world. By the way, not just human diseases, but animal and plant diseases too. That biosecurity is the one big exception to free trade that I'm prepared to accept, if you see what I mean. But let's make sure that we have in place pandemic preparedness to prevent this ever happening again, so that we can then reconstitute a free trading, free exchanging, free speaking, economy that enables us to grab the benefits of innovation wherever we are in the world. Because why should it be that if I, sitting here in Northern England, want to get hold of something, that I can only get it from 5 miles away? Bad luck if nobody's invented a computer in my county. That isn't the way the world works. We want to be able to get ideas from wherever they crop up, whether it's China or California or anywhere in between. And that way we can put the collective brain of the whole of humanity onto solving our problems. And we're going to solve this virus problem by networking the brains of people all over the world. We're not going to say that we won't use that vaccine because it was invented in Germany, not America, or vice versa. Of course not. So let's take that approach to every other problem we've got.
So I wish you well. I hope you stay safe and healthy. And I will end this conversation on a piece of optimistic information that I've shared with everyone I speak to, and that is, I have a family member who's over 65 with respiratory problems, COPD. He went into the hospital with a fever. This was a couple weeks ago. He was tested for COVID-19, for the coronavirus. He got his chest X-ray. Everything looked clear. The hospital sent him home. He never ended up with much more than a fever and a little bit of achiness. He's feeling better. And a week later, he tested positive. So we won't all be killed by this god-awful thing, although too many of us will.
Yes.
But even those of us who are right smack in its target, most will survive it. Seems to be the reality.
Absolutely. And there's another thing to cling on to in these dark days, and that is that unlike many viruses, this one seems to be almost completely harmless to children. Not completely, of course. There's always a risk, and children with underlying health things, but health problems. But when you compare that with even the flu, which tends to kill the very young and the very old, or the 1918 flu in particular was more dangerous for young people than old people, or smallpox or plague or anything else. This one does at least seem to spare children. Now, that's not much comfort for 80-year-olds, but it is a bit, because they much as they don't want to die, they also don't want their grandchildren to die. And I think, that we are going to defeat this. There's no question about it. It's not going to bring humanity to an end. We will get out of it. We will get the show back on the road. But let's do so in a way that and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Matt, it's been a pleasure to speak with you at this time. I really can't think of anyone I would rather talk to in this moment than you, the Rational Optimist. I appreciate.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's been great talking to you too, and you've put into words some of my thoughts quite better than I could do. So I'm most grateful.
I'm certain that is not true, having read your books, but I appreciate the compliment nonetheless. Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.